Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
To the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California today. Bob is off on assignment, but we are joined by a guest who has going to give us a really good, interesting interview and discussion today. We're going to be talking about Rojava, which is the autonomous Kurdish region in Northeast Syria. We are joined by Arthur Pye, who is a writer and organizer based in the Pacific Northwest. He is a member of the Emergency Committee for Rojava and recently returned from Northeast Syria, where he lived for a year conducting research and interviews about the Rojava revolution. Arthur, welcome to the Green and Red podcast.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
Yep. And just a quick background, the Kurdish autonomous areas emerged out of the Syrian civil war, which resulted from Arab Spring uprisings there in North and East Syria, which is an epicenter of conflict located between Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and other countries. The YPG and YPJ are People's Defense Units. Militias have fought with the Syrian and Turkish governments, fought against the Syrian and Turkish governments and the Islamic State. In more recent events, Turkey has been bombing Rojava's civilian infrastructure over the last week, and the Biden administration wants to send Turkey a fleet of new F-16s. And to put this in context, what we're seeing in the news right now is we're seeing a lot of news about Hamas and Israel and Gaza, but there's also this other conflict that's been happening in the Middle East for a long time as well. And so Arthur's going to be talking to us about that today. Arthur, maybe just to kick it off, could you actually just tell our listeners, for people who aren't familiar, what is Rojava?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, it's a gigantic topic, which sometimes has enough acronyms that we call it alphabet soup. So I'll try to whittle it down to its essence. Like you said, Rojava itself as a word means West Kurdistan in Kurdish, which is talking about the part of historic Kurdistan that is situated within the nation state, which we now call Syria. And like you said, within the context of the Syrian civil war, in a power vacuum that arose when the regime basically could no longer hold on to the parts of Syria which were home to the Kurdish people. The Kurdish people are like an ethnic minority, which we'll talk about in a minute. The Kurdish freedom movement, which is like a revolutionary movement, which has a whole history, which we'll also touch on, seized on this moment and basically declared autonomy. And when they did that, they implemented this radical program of grassroots democracy, anti-capitalist economics, feminism. And right now, after about 10 years, 11 years of formal autonomy, roughly 1/3 of Syria and a third of the population is governed or administered within the system, which is now formally called the Autonomous Administration of Northeast Syria. And when we say the Autonomous Administration, it sounds like a state-like structure, but it's actually an explicitly anti-state project. So that's where the word autonomy comes in. The way that this system works is that power and initiative starts down at the base, at the most local level possible, in what they call communes, which are like directly democratic neighborhood councils. And those councils are federated all the way up from this like hyper local level to like municipal level, out to regional, and the whole autonomous administration in Northeast Syria. So anyway, it has a lot of ins and outs, and we can get into the weeds later. But again, it's a revolutionary project that's situated in North and East Syria, and it works as an autonomous region right now. I don't know how much you want to get into like the background of this, or
I think it'll come up with some of the later questions, but
Cool.
but just also with Rojava, we hear a lot about the militia, the Kurdish militias, the autonomous militias, and the YPG and the YPJ. Maybe actually just explain to us a little bit about what those are.
Yeah, okay. I think the first thing that may come to mind for people who have heard something or seen something about this, like these images, which were often very romanticized and fetishized, but it's the image of a Kurdish woman with an AK-47 and a floral scarf, right? So what does that mean? There's an all-women's army in Northeast Syria, and it's called the YPJ, which is a Kurdish acronym for the Women's Protection Units. And that is an autonomous women's structure that's parallel to a group called the YPG, which is a Kurdish acronym meaning the People's Protection Units. And both of these structures came out of the Kurdish freedom movement. They're basically the self-defense forces of this movement and of this region. And they were formed originally to defend their communities, not just from the regime, but especially from like the jihadist groups like al-Nusra and ISIS that started to fill this vacuum and join the conflict, most of which were one or another outgrowth of al-Qaeda. And these are structures that come out of the Kurdish freedom movement, but they're not Kurdish only structures. So there's also Arabs fighting in these militias, Armenians, Yazidis, Assyrians, many of which have their own autonomous militias, which are like sister organizations, which now are federated together into a military alliance that's called the Syrian Democratic Forces, or the SDF. So it's hard not to get bogged down again in all of these acronyms. But the basic idea is that there is an alliance of democratically minded autonomous militias, which share enough of an ideology to support this project in Rojava of decentralized local government. And they have been the primary force fighting ISIS. They're the force that defeated ISIS territorially. So ISIS no longer holds cities or territory, although ISIS is still carrying out basically sleeper cell attacks. And so some of the work that these militias are now having to do, besides defending their region from attacks from Turkey, which is to the north, is to have paradoxically run like a revolutionary counterinsurgency campaign against a fascist insurgency, which is being led by ISIS. So trying to find these like sleeper cells that are carrying out attacks against civilians and military targets alike in the region. But just one more thing to emphasize the importance of this autonomous women's militia, something I failed to mention earlier, which is fundamental to the project in Rojava, is this idea of women's freedom, this idea of women's autonomy. So it's not just that women in Rojava have organized themselves, but it's that down to the formal social contract itself of the autonomous region, women's autonomy is institutionalized. So what does that mean? In every structure of these federated bodies of self-governance from the neighborhood on up, wherever there's a position of like leadership or responsibility, they have a co-chair system. And that means that it has to be two people, and one of them at least has to be a woman. On top of this, you have autonomous women's structures in all of the different structures of society, not just the structures of governance, but also various civil society organizations, as well as the military structures. You have women who've organized their own autonomous organizations alongside these mixed gender organizations, and they see that as a part of their own revolutionary paradigm. Without getting into the weeds of the history, basically the ideology of the movement sees the state itself as an obstacle to human freedom, an obstacle to freeing themselves, not only as the Kurdish people, but as all of the diverse peoples of the Middle East. And they see overcoming patriarchy as actually fundamental to that. So as opposed to this like old left idea that maybe feminism will come after the class struggle, they have a completely different approach that sees basically capitalism and the state as just the most institutionalized forms of patriarchy itself. So when they create a women's militia, it's not just to organize women to fight against ISIS, it's like central to their political project.
And how do they see that? This very much sounds like it's in the vein of anarchism and Zapatismo and feminism and social ecology. How do they see themselves fitting into that mix?
Yeah, really good question. You wouldn't be the first person to, especially to point out the parallels with Zapatismo. And the movement itself is aware of this. And one of the biggest similarities to the Zapatistas, I would say, is that they started out, the lineage of this ideology and of this broader Kurdish freedom movement really goes back to the founding of the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party in Turkey or North Kurdistan, depending on who you talk to. And This is like a traditional national liberation movement that was founded in the 70s in Turkey. And in a lot of ways, they started out with an ideology that was Marxist-Leninist, national liberationist, very much in the vein of the resistance in Vietnam and Cuba, these national liberation movements which took place all over the world. What happened is they started out with this paradigm, and their goal was to create an independent socialist Kurdistan as a nation state. But over the course of their struggle, and especially not only after the fall of the Soviet Union, but after the imprisonment of their leader, Abdullah Öcalan, there was like a dramatic ideological transformation that took place. And part of that transformation was a reassessment of this ideology that they were founded on, and especially a reassessment of the state itself and of patriarchy, like I was just mentioning. And so in a lot of ways, this does parallel like the transformation that happened with the Zapatistas. You have Marxist-Leninists who very much in the vein of Che Guevara and the national liberation struggles of the mid-20th century. And the Zapatistas, they, over the course of their struggle, and especially in the mixing of this left intellectual culture with indigenous Mayan culture, they had a transformation too, and came to similar conclusions about the idea of bottom-up revolution, the idea of autonomy, the idea of democracy, all these things as being central to overcoming capitalism rather than like tangential to it. And so you mentioned anarchism as well. One of the biggest influences on the Kurdish freedom movement that led to the ideology that they have today, which they call democratic confederalism, was the fact that when Abdullah Öcalan was in prison, his lawyers got him a copy of Murray Bookchin's The Ecology of Freedom, which had been translated into Turkish. And I think sometimes this story is oversimplified, like the PKK read Bookchin and then everything changed. I think that's a bit reductionist, but a lot of things were converging, right? They were already developing their critique of patriarchy. They were even already developing their critique of the state after the fall of the Soviet Union, seeing it as one of the fundamental failures of quote unquote real socialism. But I think Bookchin really distilled a lot of these ideas and took like a long view of history and the emergence of hierarchy over human civilization. And that really transformed the ideology of Öcalan, which led to him putting out a series of writings, which now are the foundation for the movement in all parts of Kurdistan, not just the PKK itself, but other organizations inspired by it. So it's really a hybrid. They don't call themselves anarchists. They don't call themselves communists. They proudly fly the flag of socialism, but they call for an anti-state democratic form of socialism.
And one of the things I read is that part of the reason that they were able to gain this sort of autonomous area is that Assad had tried to leave them alone in order to, while he was like fighting the civil war, which allowed them to gain this geography. And how, now that we see this very clearly horizontalist left militia there, how is the Syrian, I have this for other governments too, but how does the Syrian government respond to it now? How much of a threat did they see?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The answer is a little complicated. There's a really fluid, delicate balance of power taking place since the Civil War, which is as much a balance of real material forces as it is of ideology as well. But basically, if you go back before the Syrian civil war, historically, the Syrian state is run by the Ba'athist Party. This is an Arab nationalist party.
Very authoritarian.
Extremely authoritarian, right? This is a dictatorship before Bashar al-Assad. It was Hafez al-Assad, his father. In some ways, they used the word socialism, but it was an extremely authoritarian regime, and it was an Arab nationalist regime. So what does that mean for Kurds? It means they have no rights. So much like Kurds within Turkey, their language was banned. Their very existence in a lot of ways was not even acknowledged. So Kurds within Syria were not allowed to own land for a long time, did not have access to passports, the same educational opportunities, resources. They weren't allowed to speak their language. All these things are true in Turkey, and these patterns of oppression have led to the Kurdish freedom movement in the first place. So The Kurdish freedom movement sees the Assad regime as an enemy in a very real sense because historically it has oppressed Kurdish people. But this uprising happens against the Assad regime, which in its initial phases includes very broad democratic demands to democratize Syria, right?
We're seeing in Tunisia and Egypt and the Arab Spring.
And the regime responds with brutal repression. One of the things that happens in the middle of that conflict is that it militarizes quickly and to an extreme degree, and then becomes subject to an influx and takeover by various jihadist factions, Islamist factions, many of which were like directly funded by the Emirates and things, Gulf nations. And these movements, as Islamist movements, and especially as still Arab nationalist but anti-Assad opposition even, still rejected the idea of Kurdish autonomy, Kurdish identity, Kurdish rights. And so the movement had to find a third way. And so without getting too bogged down in the weeds of it, basically what happened is the regime became so bogged down in their own fight to hold on to power, they had to concentrate their forces around the capital, because there was an all-out civil war that was trying to topple the government. And way out in the north and the east, where the Kurdish people live, in these very like undeveloped parts of Syria for the most part, Kurdish people were the regime forces were weakened. In some places they all out just left. Some places there were short skirmishes. They were able to declare autonomy. And over the years, there's been a push-pull, basically because of the emergence of ISIS as this all-out, almost unprecedented genocidal Islamo-fascist movement, as well as direct attacks from Turkey. The Kurdish movement has seen the regime as a third-tier enemy. The regime has, for the most part, not been actively attacking the movement. Why? Not because they like them, not because there's any sort of political friendship or alliance. They want to crush them as well, but they just can't. The Kurdish-led forces are now heavily armed. They have their own functioning structures of governance. They have the strongest economy in Syria, and they have a lot of support, and the government can't afford to take them on while fighting the opposition. There's little pockets where control of territory has a kind of back and forth push and pull, but for the most part, the most active enemies have been ISIS and Turkey. And so there's just a pragmatic understanding that in the same way that the regime can afford to fight a war on all fronts, the revolution also can afford to fight a war on all fronts in Rojava. So both of them see themselves in opposition. The movement wants to decentralize all of Syria, and they're open about that. They have the political leadership of the autonomous administrations called the Syrian Democratic Council. They have formal proposals to democratize all of Syria within this framework of like local grassroots democracy and a pluralistic democracy, right? So that Syria shouldn't just be for Arab people, but should be a diverse democracy that includes formal representation of all the diverse peoples. And the regime wants to go back to the way that it was, wants to control all of it, wants to maintain Arab supremacy.
ISIS is the top tier foe for them. The U.S. Special Forces had been on the ground there as well, fighting with different Kurdish militias, and they were pulled at some point, I think, under the Trump administration because of relationship with the Turks. And I'm just wondering if you could. It seems like there's a lot of the friend of my friend is my enemy, and then that moves around quite a bit.
Yeah. Another really important and really big messy topic, but it's good you brought it up. So the U.S. involvement goes back to the earlier days of the Syrian civil war. Originally, the U.S. was trying to actively overthrow Assad by arming and supporting various like jihadist factions that were fighting the regime. That didn't work out too well. They obviously hadn't learned the lessons of Afghanistan and the Mujahideen.
Yeah.
Not surprising, right? The United States' role overall, as far as their motivations, of course, in Syria, much like their motivations anywhere, they have their own geopolitical interests. They're not there to support, they're sure as hell not there to support the Rojava revolution in any political sense. But circumstances came together in such a way that in in 2014, 2015, the city of Kobani, which was traditionally a Kurdish city on the border of Turkey, but on the Syrian side, was under siege by ISIS. And ISIS was making rapid gains, looked like it was going to take over the whole region, had stolen unfathomable amounts of former US military weaponry from the Iraqi government, which had in many areas collapsed almost without a fight. And the US under Obama was forced to make a decision. And it's important to emphasize this was a very reluctant decision. They knew what they were doing. They knew that this was a revolutionary movement that did not share the ideology of the US empire, but they showed an impressive capacity to fight ISIS on the ground. And so everybody expected Kobani to fall and for ISIS to take over the city and consolidate their control all the way up to the border of Turkey, but it didn't happen. And for months on end, these Kurdish fighters, armed with basically rifles and grenades, no heavy weaponry, no air support, of course, not a single tank, nothing like this, held off ISIS to an unbelievable degree. But eventually, the US intervened. And what they did was they decided that they would drop weapons and provide air support and start bombing ISIS targets. And long story short, it worked. It was in strict military terms, it was a winning combination. And the YPG, the Kurdish-led militia, went on to form this broader coalition of kind of more democratic-minded forces in Syria called the Syrian Democratic Forces to not just defend Kobani, but then moved on to liberate every inch of territory that ISIS held in Syria. And they did that in coordination with the US, especially coordination with US airstrikes, but also a certain degree of coordination on the ground with a small number of ground troops. It's important to emphasize, too, that the US has never provided any political support to Rojava. It's always been strictly a military support, and that within that military support, it's only been strictly in anti-ISIS operations. So at the same time that they're doing this limited coordination, which, to be fair, like the movement sees as very essential to their survival in operations against ISIS, the US won't lift a finger against Turkey. Of course, it's a major NATO ally. And when Turkey invaded in 2018 and 2019, the US didn't do anything. You mentioned Trump pulling out US troops. He threatened to pull out US troops, which, by the way, there's only like 900 basically like special operations units. They were along the border, and just their existence there was preventing Turkey from invading because they would have to basically go through US troops. And Turkey can't afford, as a NATO ally, to kill US soldiers for obvious reasons. And Biden basically cut a deal with Erdogan. He said, go for it. And pulled troops, ended up just pulling troops from the border, moving them to other areas. And predictably, Turkey invaded. Through these invasions, Turkey has committed unspeakable acts of ethnic cleansing, demographic change in both the region of Afrin and Serikanya now. Hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced, and the US is directly complicit in these things. What kind of jets does Turkey use to bomb Kurdish targets and other, not just military targets, by the way, civilian targets in northern Syria? US-made F-16s.
Right.
US parts in these Turkish drones also used to constantly terrorize people in Northeast Syria.
Turkey's one of the top, after Israel and Ukraine, Turkey is one of the top recipients of US military aid.
Exactly. And that's, I think, really important to emphasize, because there are, just to jump into the kind of the messiness of the conversation, there are many, unfortunately, many supposedly like principled leftists who will like completely reject the idea of the Rojava revolution, reject the idea of supporting it, out of this kind of like the enemy is my friend, and the opposite is also true sense. Know that basically, if there's any relationship between US soldiers and the Syrian Democratic Forces, then real anti-imperialists will not touch Rojava with a 10-foot pole. But I think there's a real lack of nuance there. And to me, it's not even a principled position. It's an important thing to understand. And let me tell you, people on the ground there absolutely understand that the United States is not their real friend, that the United States has and will continue to abandon them and betray them, that the US has their own selfish interests in the region, and that there are risks with receiving any kind of support from them whatsoever. But the choice that they were given was no choice at all. In Kobani, they could have either submitted themselves to be genocided by ISIS, or they could accept military aid. I think that's no choice at all. And a lot of the folks making these arguments, ironically, are probably supporters of like old left, like Soviet Union politics. And let me tell you, there was a very well-known military alliance between Stalin and the United States. They were not friends by any means, but they had a shared interest in fighting the Nazis at a time. You could view it in a similar way. That's how war works. It's not a friendship. It's not a political alliance. It's a war. It's messy.
Right. Since we're into the topic of Turkey, maybe we could. I have another question about the revolution, but I think we can get at it towards the end. But Turkey has declared itself an enemy of the achievements of the revolution in Rojava. And just this week, we were talking before we started recording about Turkey's bombing of Rojava's civilian infrastructure and things along those lines. I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what you're hearing from on the ground there, what sort of impacts this is having, and if this is going to, right now, as we all know, there's a media swirl around what's going on in Gaza. But I'm wondering what will be the impact of what's been happening with the Turks and Rojava just in the last week or two.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you bringing this up because it's honestly a very dire, very urgent situation. It's true that Turkey sees itself as an enemy of the Rojava revolution. Of course, it uses a rhetoric of anti-terrorism. It uses a rhetoric of national security. But to really understand what's happening, you have to see that Turkey is also an ultra-nationalist state. It has been since its founding, even going back to so-called progressives.
And it's taken even a more authoritarian turn since Erdogan has taken over too, correct?
It has, especially. Although the nationalism has been a constant strain, it absolutely has taken a more authoritarian turn. And so under Erdogan, who now, since the quote-unquote election earlier this year, is entering his third decade in power as a head of state, Erdogan basically has used the existence of the PKK, which is an insurgent movement within Turkey that is openly fighting the Turkish state for the rights of the Kurdish people. It uses this as a pretext to do whatever it wants to justify its own expansionist, genocidal policies. So what does that look like in Northeast Syria? As I mentioned earlier, Turkey has invaded the region of Afrin already, the region of Sarıkanye. But more recently, we've seen a dramatic escalation in Turkish aggression in the region, just literally in recent days, within a week. The way that's manifesting is that they are basically declaring an all-out war on the civilian infrastructure, the vital infrastructure of the region. They've even said this explicitly. It should be mentioned that the pretext that Turkey is giving is an attack that was claimed by the PKK in Ankara a week ago or so, which was against basically a police station outside of the Interior Ministry that injured 2 police officers. It's somehow using this as a pretext, providing no evidence, but claiming that there's a direct connection between this attack and Northeast Syria. But it used this as a pretext to declare an all-out war. And Turkish ministers basically said, they called it YPG infrastructure, whatever that means, that the very infrastructure of Northeast Syria is now a target. And so what do? They started bombing energy facilities. They have bombed oil wells, electrical plants, factories, water facilities, food facilities, grain silos, hospitals, literally hospitals. So now what's happening? About 2 million people are without electricity as winter is drawing near. Civilians are obviously being killed as these targets are being bombed. But basically, Turkey's goal, as we understand it, is to make the region unlivable. That's the tactic that they're using. They have done outright ground invasions and occupations of territory in Rojava. But increasingly, because of the geopolitical situation and Turkey's need to get at least some form of tacit approval from the US or Russia, who respectively control the airspace in northern Syria, they need that to carry out a ground invasion effectively, or at least to win it, basically, against the SDF. And they haven't quite been able to muster that. So what have they been doing? They've been using drones all out to terrorize the civilian population, to carry out regular assassinations of political figures, longtime committed movement activists, women's rights activists, not just military by any means, but many civilian targets. To create a climate of fear, a climate of instability, uncertainty, and increasingly to just physically destroy the infrastructure that's keeping people alive, that's making the region livable. So they want to see a mass exodus of the region. They want to clear out these areas so that it's easier to occupy in the future. And they also want to create dissatisfaction with the project of building the autonomous administration, so that the people in the region eventually basically blame the revolution for their problems. So there's a lot that they can do to attack the revolution without actually invading on the ground. And we're seeing that play out right now on a staggering scale. And just to mention again, this is all with support from US planes, US parts, and like diplomatic cover, right? So when the United States, like the State Department will put out these statements like, we call on all parties to de-escalate and honor ceasefire agreements. Well, what does that mean? You're calling on a COVID-19 hospital technician to de-escalate the conflict. They're being bombed at civilian targets, right? There's an aggressor, and you're providing material and diplomatic support to this aggressor. It's pretty hard to see. Those of us who are already lefties and anti-imperialists, of course, it's not surprising to see that the United States is not jumping to the rescue of this revolutionary project. But it is like a hypocrisy which we need to be calling out forcefully and doing everything that we can to push in the small ways that we're able, to push for diplomatic support and concretely to end military aid to Turkey.
Yeah, it's interesting that U.S. military strategy, at least in the modern term, it predates that. But targeting civilian infrastructure was part of the strategy in Desert Storm in '91. It was part of the strategy with the U.S. bombing of the former Yugoslavia in '99. It's definitely the strategy in 2003 in the invasion of Iraq. And so the fact that our allies, and this is also what the Israelis are doing in Gaza, the fact that our allies that we fund are using the same strategies is like not surprising at all. And it goes back further than that. It's what the U.S. did in World War II, and it's what the U.S. did in North Vietnam.
No, it's absolutely true. It's straight out of the imperial playbook. And that's what it is. It's also imperialism. It's just that I think it's important that we can recognize that not only getting back to this question of how do we define anti-imperialism, how do we take a stance on this issue as principled anti-imperialists in a region where the U.S. is playing a role, I think we should see that the U.S. is not the only country that's capable of imperialism and colonialism at the same time, right? And to see the role that the U.S. is playing in supporting imperialism of other nations. And Turkey is a great case in point there.
And I'm sure there's some geopolitics around Ukraine and Russia with the Turks, where Biden doesn't want to alienate Erdogan because of that front.
It's only strengthened Turkey's position because, just like you said, I would not say that the dynamic is new. It's basically the same overall dynamic, but Turkey's position has been strengthened, and Biden's reluctance is largely a result of the Ukraine conflict.
One thing you had mentioned is that scandalized New Jersey Senator Robert Menendez, who was the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, was actually being a bit of a block on the sale of F-16s to Turkey. And the Emergency Committee on Rojava, who you work with, has been lobbying and advocating with members of Congress around this aid package. And I'm wondering if you could just actually speak to that a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. So it's true, as bombs continue to rain down on civilians in Northeast Syria, some with drones, but some with American-made F-16s. Mr. Joseph Robinette Biden is pushing Congress to sell a whole new package, a whole new fleet of F-16s, in addition to modernization kits. So Turkey already has US F-16s, but it's been a while since they received them, and they require like updates in their onboard technology and their weapon systems to continue to function. And so that's a part of this package that Turkey is requesting. Of course, this is all part of these like higher level games of some of these Scandinavian countries' accession into NATO during the Ukraine conflict. And without getting into the nitty gritty of all of that, Biden is continuing to push Congress to approve this sale. The way that the law works, as far as we understand, is that the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate has a really strong point of leverage, can basically veto a sale like this, which the president cannot just push through unilaterally. Previously, like you said, it was Bob Menendez in this position. He's had a whole scandal related to his relationship.
And he's been indicted.
Yeah, it's a very juicy story, which we don't have time to get into. We encourage everybody to look into it. But yeah, it's related to his relationship with the Egyptian government. So he's still technically a senator, but he's being indicted, and he's no longer the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. So there's a new chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. His name is Senator Ben Cardin. He's from the state of Maryland. He has shown like public criticism of Turkey's human rights record, has shown a reluctance around the F-16 sale, but is also showing some signs of possibly wavering. So he's saying things like, we're going to look at all the facts, we're going to review the details, I'm going to talk to the president about this, and we'll figure out what makes the most sense. That's very concerning. And so something that we've been doing at ECR, Emergency Committee for Rojava, is we've been trying to start building some pressure against Ben Cardin. Something people can do if they want to get more involved in this, they can go to defendrojava.org, where we try to put up like toolkits for people to contact their Congress members and give them talking points and contact information for people like Ben Cardin. But it's true right now, the fate of this sale is basically in Ben Cardin's hands.
Is there a Kurdish diaspora in the U.S. that you've worked with?
There is, and some of them are active in the Emergency Committee for Rojava. It's limited. In a lot of ways, I think it's true that like a majority of the Kurds that live in the U.S. are actually from the part of Kurdistan, which is in Iraq.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Yeah, because of the history of the U.S. role in that region. But there are Kurds from friends from Bakur, from Turkish part of Kurdistan, from Rojava. There also is a U.S. office of the Syrian Democratic Council, which is the political leadership of Rojava, that operates in Washington, D.C. So there's a woman named Sinan Mohammed, who is a Kurdish woman from Afrin in Rojava, and she lives in the U.S. now, and she's basically a diplomatic representative of Rojava to the extent that a non-state actor can have something like an embassy. And so we try to coordinate with everybody that we can coordinate with, but we see our role as trying to build a grassroots solidarity movement. And there's different pieces to that. So one part of that is like engagement with the Kurdish community. Another part of that is trying to build relationships with social movements in the US, right? Something that we've also been doing is building bridges between movements in the US and movements in Rojava to break it into pieces, right? Cooperative movements in the US, putting them directly in touch with worker cooperatives in Rojava, or feminist organizations, trying to facilitate dialogue and solidarity with feminist organizations in Rojava.
Is that there's a good number of Americans and Westerners which have, like yourself, gone and reported, but then others have gone and have gravitated there to join the militias and support. There's a somewhat famous interview that was on Chapo Trap House with an American leftist who had spent time there. And I'm just wondering how, and also there's the romantic version where it's like it's the new Lincoln Brigade from the like Spanish Civil War. And I'm wondering how much of a factor are like foreign, I don't want to call them foreign fighters, but like foreign members of the militia a factor.
Yeah, they call them internationalists. They're very much a factor. During the ground war against ISIS especially, there were hundreds of internationalist volunteers who traveled to Rojava and fought alongside the YPG or within the YPG and YPJ, right? So they're like the mixed and the women's autonomous units. So both men and women from around the world. And there, like you said, there's a lot of like high profile examples of this. There's been a number of books that have been written in many different ways. There also was very interestingly, during the height of the war against ISIS, it wasn't just leftists who joined. There were also some people with mixed political motivations, as you can imagine, who wanted to go fight this war against ISIS, including a number of US military vets. But for the most part, I think it's people who were like inspired by the political project and wanted to travel there in solidarity with the project to help defend it. And yeah, a lot of people, you mentioned the Abraham Lincoln Brigades, which for listeners that aren't familiar with it, was like the international volunteer unit in the Spanish Civil War that was fighting the Spanish fascists and defending the Republic or the Revolution, depending on kind of who we're talking about. And so much like this, there's been a structure created actually within the YPG and the YPJ. There's something called YPG International and YPJ International. And in those structures, foreign volunteers join alongside like Kurdish and Arab and other local fighters. But it's also important to mention, I think, that there's civilian structures that people join in as volunteers too. So it's not just as fighters that internationalists have traveled to Rojava, but people have done all sorts of work there in civil society. And people like myself have traveled there to conduct research, do interviews, try to learn more about the revolution and translate its experience, its ideas, and the words of its direct participants to a broader audience or like a Western audience, an international audience. There's all kinds of different work. There's media work, there's civil society work, there's there's medical work, anything you can imagine. And
You,
that
you,
this day.
you had actually talked about going to Aleppo after the February earthquake, and then did some of those folks who were doing civil work go and do relief work, etc., or is it over there? You had actually talked about more like grassroots collective relief that was going on in Aleppo, and actually just talk about that a little bit, and if there was any internationalists participated in that.
Yeah, in the case of the earthquake in February, the region was like rocked by this earthquake in Rojava. I myself was in Kamishla, which is like far on the eastern side. And in the majority of Rojava, while the buildings shook and we all had to run out of the building, people weren't hurt. The buildings hadn't collapsed like they had in these like devastated parts of Turkey and far western Syria. But yeah, after the earthquake, I traveled to Aleppo to cover like the aftermath of the earthquake. And for people who don't know, Aleppo is in far western Syria, so the other side, and it's almost entirely controlled by the regime. But in this one little hill in the north of the city, there's a neighborhood called Sheikh Massoud, and it's an autonomous Kurdish majority neighborhood which governs itself in the same structure and the same philosophy as the Rojava Revolution, even though it's isolated and basically under siege by the regime, which controls who they let in, what supplies they let in. So myself and some other journalists, we were able to get in. And like a week into the earthquake, the regime had still not let in supplies. They couldn't even get blankets or heating gas or medicine into this neighborhood because the regime was just blocking it off. And this is a place that, unlike other parts of Rojava, this is a place where like buildings had fully collapsed. People had been killed, and also people whose buildings did not fully collapse. These buildings were damaged, and there was a tremendous climate of fear that the buildings were still going to collapse. And so people were displaced en masse from their homes, living out in the streets. It was the winter, it was cold, it happened to be raining. And like you mentioned, something I mentioned to you like before we were recording, was in this little neighborhood that's totally under siege, has no resources, but is nonetheless organized in this grassroots democratic way. It was really inspiring to see how people came together and were able to respond to a situation like that. So just like elsewhere in Rojava, the structures of governance were based in these like hyper local neighborhood communes, structures where like basically like block by block, people knew all of their neighbors. They had their own assemblies, and they were organizing to make sure that every family was accounted for, that their needs were being met. If they needed a place to be housed, that they would find unused space. There was not a square inch of the neighborhood that was, whether it's an office space or a closet or anything, that was not being used to house a displaced family. And meeting with one of the council co-chairs there said to me, basically I'm paraphrasing, he said something like, we may not have material things here, but the people live with one heart. And it was just incredibly moving and inspiring to see what, not just how people govern themselves under this kind of a paradigm, but how a community that's organized in this directly democratic way can respond to a disaster in a dynamic way, can actually meet people's needs, can take care of people in a more dynamic way than this place like literally across the street on the other side of the checkpoint, where people living under the regime were really struggling because they didn't have that kind of social structure where their neighborhood is actually like people are taking care of each other. So I thought that was very inspiring.
Yeah, I think that's an important message, and that actually makes me, friends of mine were the folks who helped start Common Ground hurricane relief in New Orleans after 2005. And yep, Scott Crow, Malik Rahim, and that actually makes me think of that. It's a pretty important story to tell, and I think it's actually a good sort of wrap up for what we've been talking about.
Yeah.
One thing I would ask is if folks want to get involved with the emergency committee for Rojava, because our audience is mainly U.S. based, and we'll put things in the show notes. But if you just want to talk a little bit about that, about how people can get involved and put pressure on Cardin or put pressure on Biden or what have you.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we would love to have your listeners join us, get involved in one way or another. The best way to do that is to either go to our website, which is simply defendrojava.org, or to email us at info@defendrojava.org. You can also find us on any of our social media platforms at Defend Rojava. And one of the things that people get when they get in touch with us is it's not just opportunities for like lobbying and advocacy. We also host study groups where we actually get to talk more kind of deeply and unapologetically about the revolutionary politics of the movement. We've done study groups about the economics of the movement. We've done study groups comparing it to Zapatismo. And we also give updates about what's happening on the ground in the region. Another thing, like I mentioned earlier, is that people are part of social movement organizations in the US that want to get directly in touch with the movement in Rojava. We try to help facilitate that kind of dialogue. And like I said, we're really trying to build like a broad-based grassroots solidarity movement in the United States. It's sorely needed, but there's also just so much potential for this because, again, I don't know, it's easy for this conversation to get bogged down in all of these terrible things that are happening, or all of this like really policy wonky geopolitical analysis. But at the end of the day, what brings most of us to this organizing is that we're just incredibly inspired by the revolution that's happening in Northeast Syria. It's not something to treat as utopia. It's far from perfect. In reality, there, as somebody who's been on the ground, say it's very messy. It's full of contradictions. It's full of limitations. We didn't have time to get into all of that today, but it really is a place where the lessons of like revolutionary transformation are being learned in real time and experimented with, and people are really doing their best to create structures through which they can govern themselves autonomously and really push through to build a fundamentally different kind of society beyond capitalism, beyond the state, beyond patriarchy. And I think principled leftists, progressives have just so much to learn from it that even if people don't get involved in ECR, I encourage everybody to try to learn more about this topic. There's also a lot of wonderful books and documentaries. I don't know if you want to mention them. We could throw some in the show notes. It's up to you.
We can throw them in the show notes.
Love it.
Yep. Folks, you've been listening to Arthur Pye, journalist who works with the Emergency Committee for Rojava, has also spent a year traveling and researching and reporting on what's going on in Rojava. He's just given us a fantastic discussion about the history of Rojava and the politics and the geopolitics and everything from what small communities are doing to help each other to the geopolitics between the US and Turkey and ISIS and Syria, etc. Arthur, thank you for joining us. This has been a great conversation.
Scott, thank you so much for having me, man.
Yep.
Keep up the great work. It's a great podcast.
Yep. Folks, if you like what you're hearing, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. If you're listening to us on one of the many podcast platforms that we are on, give us a rate and review. It helps us with the algorithms. And if you really like us, make a donation to greenandredpodcast.org by hitting that support button on our website at greenandredpodcast.org, or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. And much love to everybody out there, and go out and misbehave. And we'll talk to you all again real soon.
هینای هر دم روی ارشاد چند هزار سالان جاره گل نبوم دلشاد مزنا هینای هر دم روی ارشاد چند هزار سالان جاره گل نبوم دلشاد دیروه البوزر داغا هجارو نفسا ای دلی آزادیه بوهایا گلان بوهایا گلان آزادی جهان بسینه şimdi be khwezayla khwesriya khweda çardam sannu bedbe ruçkini hijada şimdi be khwezayla khwesriya khweda eşyariya dirukiye dinavi gerdumda ey deri azadiye her velatida her velatida ey deri azadiye her velatida şinammesin dildigi esman Miraçleri kuşak kevnar el mezrabotan Riberi şinammesin dildigi esman Miraçleri kuşak kevnar el mezrabotan Sureti vizeriye bir yavın destan Ey be azadiye nuruca gellan Nuruca gellan وادي